The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. This is Bob McElroy, and I'm going to be helping Paul present this webinar today. Paul is now ready. You ready to start?
Sure enough. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. In this webinar today, we'll be presenting the import process, also how it can affect the creation of databases, and finally, how archiving information can help you recover data and print reports from any prior period. I'm Paul Lentz. I'm one of the 4 fixed assets instructors. I've worked with Sage since 2000, so this is my 20th year teaching this software. This is the legal disclaimer that we're required to show. It emphasizes that our work is copyright, but also that we're not legally responsible, that you need to get your own legal advice on using our software. So the 3 topics we're going to cover today are the custom import process. Most of the time today we'll be talking about that process. Then how creating a database file might be generated by needing to have an extra database to put a copy of an import into. And then also just copying a company, making an archival example of a company at a particular period in time, like the end of a month, the end of a year, the end of a quarter, the end of any particular time that you think you may need to go back to run reports on the data at that time, or just look at the status of the data at that time. So those are the 3 topics we'll be covering today. The first one being the custom import. The advantages to doing an import are multiple, but the ones that we're going to highlight today are here. Initially, filling in fixed asset data with your data from some other program or from a spreadsheet, if that's the status or the progression that you're at a particular moment in time. You might say, how do I get a lot of asset records into Sage Fixed Asset to start with? So we talk a lot about in class putting them in one at a time, or generating multiple copies of one that might already be there, or using templates to build an extra one or an extra several. But initially, you need to have your information in there. We encourage you to take advantage of our product services group, which can make your assets available to you in our program when it's first installed. So that may cost a little extra money, but it gives you the option not to have to go through the process we're going to describe today. And of course, describing today should give you the ability and the skill to be able to build one of these on your own. So if you do decide to fill in an empty Sage Fixed Asset company with your data, you may want to import that data in bulk rather than create each record manually. Before using Sage Fixed Assets, many companies that were using programs that can also create spreadsheets out of their data, so they've already achieved that process. Then getting that spreadsheet into our program is what we'll mainly be concentrating on today. Once the import process is perfected, it can be used to add assets in bulk in the future. So if you do build your own import file, or you're able to get a copy of the import file from our product services group, then you'll be able to use that import map, it's called, which is the link from any spreadsheet into our program. So it can be an advantage over doing it one at a time. Generally speaking, it'd be best to include in your import more than one book. We anticipate that people are going to use 7 books, but quite often people don't use all 7 books and just concentrate on what they think they have and what they're going to need, which is usually the tax book and the internal book in our program. But there's several other books, the AMT book, a state book, the ACE book, and then even a Budget 1 and Budget 2 book that you can use for a given purpose. So we anticipate, our best practice is to tell you, try to include as many books as you possibly can. Generally speaking, it would also be best to include more than the 5 critical fields. So in a minute here, I'll be showing you the 5 critical fields, but if you include all 5 of these, we anticipate that there may be other pieces of information that you know about your data that you should also include. Things like the description, the 3 GL account fields, beginning data, which is data that is prior depreciation on an asset. So if you're bringing assets in from some other program where you've done some prior depreciation, you don't want to lose that data, but you want to make our program start with that data and work on from that data. That's put in our begin fields in order to make that work. So the value of the import map itself. Before conducting the import, you'll be creating an import map which links columns from the spreadsheet that you have to fields in Sage Fixed Assets. You'll be able to, in some cases, for example, in the book fields, you may have the same date that an asset begins depreciating, or the same amount that an asset begins depreciating. If you have that in one column in your spreadsheet, you can map that to more than one book in our program. And I'll be showing you that when I do the import process to show you how to map more than one column. This map can then be used to quickly import multiple asset data at a later time. If you've got this working, you'll realize it takes a little work to get it working in the first place, but you don't want to lose that effort, and you can use it later to bring multiple asset records in. If you are ever just performing an ad hoc custom import, then it's not necessary to save the map, but if you go through the effort of creating a map, you probably want to save it to be sure. The data validation that we'll have as a process of the import process, you'll see, will be the program will tell us if there are any errors in any of our rows of data. The errors will be serious, will not be allowed to be imported. Sometimes you could go back to the spreadsheet and figure out the error and fix it, and then that row will be imported, that asset will be imported. Other times, if you've got maybe several thousand records you're importing, you might just say, no, give me what you can, and I'll work on the ones that you can't. So the data validation report, is the assessment report, is going to show us which of the records can be imported and which cannot. It will also report any warnings of data that we're trying to import. The warnings are not serious, at least to the program import process. They can be imported, but they may be serious to you individually as a user of the software. So they're just ways that the program looks at the data and says, that looks a little strange to me, and you might want to take a second look at it. So the exceptions report that you get is going to give you some of those ideas also. We'll be switching over to the program and start the import process here now. So this is what the program looks like. For the import process, we go to the File menu, come down to the Company Utilities, and then down to Custom Import. I'm going to be importing an example that we use in class. Closing the company down here first. I'm going to be importing an example that we use in class because it's already there. There are a few things that I'll mention as I go through it that I'll try to say, okay, at this point, you're going to have a little bit of difficulty in creating this map. Because the map, in our case, for this example, is already built. The file to import is already built. Everything is already working perfectly. And we could just go through this process and just say, okay, folks, that's how it is in 10 minutes. But we want to stop and indicate that there are a few points along the way that you're going to be given warnings, you're going to be given errors, you're going to be given things that you need to work on. So this welcomes us to the wizard to doing the import. We go on to the next step. By the way, we're going to be going through these 7 steps here on the left. We're going to be selecting the file to import. We're going to be selecting the company to import it into. And I may create this company just on the fly, so I have no other assets in the company. And the only thing I will have in the company is what I've imported. The import type, we'll only get one type with this type of import because we're only importing into a blank company. The field map, this is where all the work gets done, where you decide, okay, what is in my spreadsheet and where does it belong in Sage Fixed Assets? We'll be selecting those fields and then finally finishing with doing the import. So the next step is find the file. So we browse to the files that we have, and keep in mind where I'm looking for these files, because you have this if you have our program. With every version of our program that goes out, we send out this folder called training, and it has both an import, set of a spreadsheet to import, and the import mapping. You could start with that spreadsheet and just say, okay, how do I make my spreadsheet look like that one? Or start with the map and say, okay, how do I make my map work with my spreadsheet? So I'm going to go into the training folder. I'm going to be importing the file that we've created for the sample that we show called importing 7 books, all 7. Notice it's a .csv file. You can import Excel files if you go down here to requesting a certain format of the files you're importing and directly import from an Excel file. We do a sample of importing from a CSV file because it's a set of flat data. There's no possibility of having a formula in this spreadsheet, and formulas can cause problems when you're doing an import. So I'm going to go ahead and open up that one. And move on to the next step. Now the company is going to be called Import Test, but I was doing some testing work yesterday and I already created that. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new company called Import Test 2 just for today. You'll notice, and if you haven't already seen this when you've opened up our program, that we do have the option to work with US companies, Canadian organizations, or government and nonprofit organizations. We're going to do this example with a US company. So this is just going to be my import test number 2. Differentiated from number 1. I'm not going to bother filling in all of the other information because I don't need that to be able to do the import. But if I were concerned about making this company look like a real company or making it match the data in some way, then I would go in and fill in some of the information about when the company started, what I want my starting system number to be, and how I want some of the books to flow. Maybe what my fiscal year end is, but those are things that I don't care about with this particular import. I'm also going to be putting this into the database called Test 100. Actually, I better put it in the working database for now. I have a copy of the sample data in the working database, and if I needed to, I could create a new database just for this purpose, but that's going to be a second part of the lesson today. So I'll save that for later. So I say, okay, I want that to be the company I'm going to import into. New company is created. Are you sure you want to continue? There is a slight possibility that having a new company in a database that already has other companies in it could increase the size of that database. So there's always a question that the program has, are you sure you want to do this? So I do for this example. So go ahead and say yes. And that's what I'm going into. The import test number 2, probably should have spelled the name right. The database is the working database, and I can move on to the next step. Now, the process of creating a new field map would be if I were starting from scratch. I'm not. For this example, I'm using the example that you have available to you if you have our program. So I'll go ahead and go to that mapping. It's going to be the mapping with 7 books, and I'm going to do the mapping with 7 books with begin data, excuse me, as if someone were bringing this data in from another spreadsheet where depreciation had occurred or another program. Beginning data is prior depreciation. So we'll be taking a look at how some of that data gets imported and take a look at where it comes in. So I'm going to go ahead and import that one. By the way, notice that this import map is a .imp. It's created when you create the map, and I'll show you in a minute here what it looks like. And I should be able to move on to the next step down. Now, if we were building this from scratch, the field mapping would be blank. We would have down here in the file display a copy of the file that I chose to import my data from, at least the first 15 rows of it. And the first row, of course, is going to be showing the titles of the columns. So I'll be looking at the titles of the columns and trying to decide which of these columns do I need in the program, which am I required to have in the program, and which are just useful to have there. And maybe, as I do in this sample data, and I'll show you this in just a minute, I have some columns that are actually duplicate information. I have tax book information, I have internal book information. In fact, I have all 7 book information, but I have the acquired or the placed in service date the same in every book. So one of the things that I want to show you is that if your program or your spreadsheet only has one column that has the placed in service date or the acquired value or any other book information that even the book information you're required to have, you could just say one column does it. One column has the information. That's all that I need to bring it in. So let's take a look at one of these. If we scroll down through the list, we'll see that we have all the tax book information first. Placed in service date, acquired value, depreciation method, and so on. Then below that, I have the internal book information. Again, depreciation, placed in service date, acquired value. It turns out with this sample data the placed in service date and the acquired value information is exactly the same for all books. So I'm going to demonstrate that I could just use that one column of tax book information. I'm going to remove the column for the internal book. Notice it's the AH column. So I'll remove that and then go back up to the column that had the tax book information in it. The placed in service date for tax book information was column V. And I'm going to be able to use that column V. So I'll scroll down over here on the left to column V. And I'll say I want that to be also the internal book information. In the field category section, we can request to see only the fields that are necessary for what I'm doing. And right now I'm working with critical fields, and I'm only interested in the internal book critical fields that might not have been set. So I look in here, and sure enough, there's that placed in service date, the internal book that I just removed a minute ago as an AH column, but I'm going to make it the V column. So I go ahead and choose V in my columns, choose placed in service date in my fields, and move it over to the right. Then notice in the field map, it now shows that V is being mapped to two different books. So you can take one of your columns and say, well, that's the only column I get. Do I need to make 7 columns that are one for each of the books? Not if they're all the same. If they're all the same, you can just take one column and make it go to any of the books that it would be the same, as I've done in this example. Okay. Down at the bottom, it says, where do I want to begin my import? It says it's going to automatically start beginning at row 2, which turns out to be good for my set of data because I have the column row 1 being the title of what's in the column. But if I just do a row number 2, I'm going to get a report that's not going to give me any errors. And I really would like to show you guys an error. So I'm going to go ahead and say, start at row number 1, and go ahead and have the title not be importable. For example, you'll notice in row number 2, the asset ID is a 6-character digit number, but the title is a set of letters that are more than 6 digits. So the program would say row number 1 cannot be imported into that field. Row number 2 could be, but class, row number C cannot, or column C cannot. The title class cannot go into a field that only holds 2 characters, which the class field does. It only holds 2 characters. So some of the fields are like that. For example, column F has to be a date, and the title acquisition date doesn't fit in that field because it's not a date. So those kind of things I'll be showing you, but I have to have it look in row 1 just to tell me that it cannot use that row. Okay, once I've done any modification to the map, or if you're building your map from scratch, the program is going to expect that you want to save that map and maybe even print it out to take a look at it later, or even to take a look at it now, especially if there's some problems with it. Later, when we look at the acceptance report, we're going to see it tells us in column such and such, or row such and such, column such and such, we have a problem. Well, without having the map printed out, we'd have to look at our spreadsheet and figure out what does it mean by that row and that particular column, and what is the problem with the data in that information. So it's going to ask me if I want to save the map. And by the way, if I forget to save the map and try to move on to the next item, but I've done some modification in the map, like I just have right now, then it's going to give me a question and say, wait a minute, this is too important. You probably ought to be saving that map. Well, I don't have an exact copy of that map that I just changed, so I'll go ahead and say, yes, let's go ahead and save this map, which you probably want to do. Notice that we do have a save of a previous map. That's what I've been using the example here. But I'm going to go ahead and say that this is my 2002 July 14 import test. Usually I want to have a good indication on the title for this import map of what I'm doing with this. So I'm going to go ahead and say save that one, and then it'll be in that list of maps that I can use if I want to later. Now this is the step of summary information that says, okay, you're ready to do your import, almost. Here's the summary information. You're going into import test number 2. You're pulling out of the file import7books.csv. Here's the mapping that you chose, and you can take a look at it here if you have any question about what you did, or you can go back and print it if you don't have a copy of it. And then over at the right, it's going to say you probably ought to validate your data. You could just go down and click finish. And after you've done enough validation that you're pretty sure it's valid and you've made your final change, you could just maybe go down to finish. But I always check validate anyway. remember that it's going to find an invalid row of row number 1. Every other row, there's 205 records that I'll be importing. Actually, a total of 206. 206 was row number 1. But 205 good records because these records have been scrubbed. There's nothing wrong with them. However, there will be a few exceptions that they put into our data so that you could see what an exception looks like. So again, this is the kind of lesson that we do in the import lesson in our class. So I'm trying to generate as much of this as possible for you to see what it would look like. So I'm going to click validate, and this will generate the validation report. There were import exceptions found. So the exceptions should be looked at either because they're just exceptions and not serious, but I should still try to understand what the program is telling me about what is an issue and what's not. But there are also those errors from row number 1. So I'm going to say, okay, let me review that. So I click view the report. Notice there were 205 good records and 128 exceptions generated even by 205 good records. So here's a copy of the report. I'll pull it up so you can read it okay. So it's the import exceptions report, indicates the file that I pulled the data from, indicates the field mapping that I created when I went in, and when I went back to save it, it went ahead and used that save that I did. Notice it says in row number 1, we have a problem. There is a warning. Now the warnings were okay. It just says in column C, remember the column C said class, it exceeds the field map size, which is only 2. So the data will be truncated. That means CL would try to go in, but then it goes on to tell me row number 1 has really got a problem. Every one of these errors says this row is unacceptable. There's enough of a problem in this row that we cannot import this data. Okay. Well, I know what that data is, and I know why it has a problem. So I'm going to say, okay, row number 1, I shouldn't have even asked for it. So all of these row number 1s are not really a problem. I move on to the second page, and still row number 1, row number 1, row number 1. Finally, row number 3. Here, I get to an exception that's only a warning that it says, this data that you're trying to import doesn't look right. And it tries to explain to me what it thinks is wrong with that data. Well, I know my data. This is all sample data that I worked with for 20 years. So like I say, I know it. The real problem here is that we have some data in there that could be compartmentalized from a building. Maybe the roof in the building, the fire alarm system in the building, or something like that, that could be less than the life of the building, which is 39 years. And we've given it 39 years, which we did back in 2008 because we didn't know we didn't have to. So row 3 has 3 columns that are like that. Row 4, 3 columns, 5, 3 columns, and so on. And we go to the last page, and all of these columns, you'll notice, all these rows, you'll notice have pretty much the same problem until we get down to the last 3 here, or the last 4. 140, excuse me, the last 5. 141, 42, 43, 176. And the reason I'm mentioning those is because I'll be looking up those records to see what did it mean that the value in column P exceeds the maximum field size. Again, I've worked with this data long enough that I know exactly what this means. It means that the data that I'm trying to import will not fit into a field size of 25, which column P is trying to map to a field size of 25. And it just says, we're going to cut off that data at 25. So if it has more than that, just know you're only getting the first 25 characters. Well, in my particular case, I'm going to say that's acceptable. Otherwise, I'll go back and look at the spreadsheet and figure out, okay, how do I make that data look like something that could fit in the 25 character field? So this is an example of what we're going to import. I'm going to go ahead and close this report down and go back to the import process. Now, you'll notice that there are 205 good records. It's going to try to do 206, but it's going to skip number 1, which again, I just shouldn't have asked for number 1. I'm okay with that. It's also going to skip the exceptions that are just warnings. That it says, okay, for whatever purpose, whatever reason you have, you are willing to accept those as warnings and work with them afterwards for some reason. So I'm going to go ahead and click finish. Watch the number here of validating the records as it goes through the rows and think about what it would be like. It says, are you sure you want to do this? Again, it wants to be sure that we're not putting this into a company that we don't intend to put it into. In my case, I'm putting it into a test, so I can always check it later. So I say, yes, I'm ready to do the import. But watch as it counts through the records here. Imagine if you had a couple thousand records you were trying to put into a spreadsheet and trying to do those one record at a time. It's a whole lot easier to do it this way. Again, It says you've completed that import. Do you want to take a look at it, or you want to look at another one, or look at the report even, because it thinks that those exceptions ought to be looked at. Well, I've already looked at them, so I don't care. I say, okay, I'm ready to move on. The last step would not be to finish again, but let me just mention that, because if you do walk away and take a coffee break, you can come back and look at this box and think, I wonder, did I do that? Because it doesn't seem to be an indication here on the box that I did it. You might click finish again. Unfortunately, that will import all 205 records back into this same company that you requested it to go into, but it will put it at the bottom of the 205 that are already there, essentially making 2 copies of the same set of data. So be very careful that you either don't take a coffee break, or if you do, you trust the process to finish, get done, and you're ready to close when the process is done. So I'm going to close this process down and take a look at the data. I go down to the System Administration function button down at the bottom, open up the company, and then I'm going to open up that test number 2, which I put into my working database. Then I'll take a look at the data. And if you ever do take one of our classes, you'll start to recognize, wow, that looks like the same data that I work with as a sample. Yes, when we exported this data to make a sample set that we could use to import, we used the sample company that we used in our class. So you'll recognize that. Now remember, I had done something on page 14 on asset in the row number 141. So I'm going to take a look at asset 141 up here under system number. Click enter and go to 141. Take a look at that record, and it said the import of that record for column P got truncated. So sure enough, column P happened to be the vendor column or the vendor field. So there are allowed 25 characters in that field, and initially the data that I was trying to import said everything office furniture, RE, but there were 27 characters. And the program says, okay, but I can't do that. The field that I'm trying to put that data into only holds 25 characters. And you'll notice that most of our fields only hold 25 characters. There are some like description that can hold up to 100 characters. GL codes, description holds up to 80 characters. GL codes can hold up to 100 characters. So again, there's a few that we just say, okay, let's not limit you at all, but some of these do. And here's an example of it truncating. If I were very careful about my spreadsheet, I might go into the spreadsheet and say, let me try to abbreviate this in some way that would allow it to be held in a 25 character field. That would be one of the ways that I might solve that problem. I also mentioned to you that I'd be importing import data. Here I'm importing data of prior depreciation on these assets. As of 12/2009, I had done prior depreciation on this asset. So I'm importing that data into the begin fields and then telling Satrix Asset pick up from where that program left off. Okay, so this really ought to say prior data and prior year to date, prior cube to indicate that it's prior depreciation information, but it's the programmer's way of saying our program is going to begin here. Going to start here, start on this service, or start on this depreciation date and start depreciating. Okay, so that's an example of asset number 141 doing what it did. And you'll notice that if I look back at the list of assets, I got the first asset. I didn't get an asset of, excuse me, let me go back to the first one here. Go back to the beginning. It starts with the first asset, not with the row of information that described what was in the columns. I have all of that in my program. Okay, so that's the import process. And now I'd like to ask you a question to see if I have covered this information. So let me switch back to my PowerPoint presentation and move on to the next slide. So the first question is, are critical fields, you'll need to remember what I called a critical field, are they required when importing asset records? So you're going to be given an option to answer yes or no to this question.
Okay, Paul, I have launched the question.
Okay.
So please answer yes or no.
And we really would like to get the vote from everybody on this. Number one, to make sure we've covered the material adequately, but also to make sure that you're there and paying attention to our presentation. we're getting a notice of how many of you have voted, so I'm going to wait for a few minutes for that to give all of you a chance.
Okay, it looks like most people have voted. I'm going to go ahead and take down the question. And the question has been closed.
Okay, and of course the answer to the question was yes. The 5 critical fields that I mentioned, the property type, the placed in service date, the acquired value, the life of the asset, and the depreciation method. Those are 5 critical fields that are required in order to do depreciation. So our program is going to require that you import that set of information or get it in there somehow. And it won't let you do an import without the data. If you're importing data, you'll need to be sure that you include all of that data. Okay. Okay, let me move on to our next slide then. So our next topic is going to be creating a new database file. The database file is what holds any companies that you have. You can have more than one company in a database. In fact, let's move on here to the next slides. There are several reasons why you might have multiple databases. One is that you might have a test database, which I just set up right now so that I can put this import test into that database. I'm calling it my working database, but the only thing in it right now is this testing option. So I might call it a test database. You also probably should have, and our best practices here we're talking about, is to have an archive database that you put in archive information based on the status of data at a particular point in time, or something you might want to run a report on later. Our program moves forward in time, so it only has the most current depreciation information. But at any given period in time, say the end of a month or the end of the year, it really is good for you to make a copy of that data and say, okay, I need to lock down that data as of the end of that month or the end of that year. And then if anybody asks, what did the data look like? Run a report or just look at the data at the end of a given month in the past or the end of a year in the past or any period in time, any quarter, any month that you ask for. So you might say, I need to have that readily available so when they walk in, I don't have to hunt for it, either hunt for the piece of paper or the file. I can just pull up my archive and run the report that they're asking for. Another reason for creating multiple databases is because you might have a large company. Now, by large, I mean somewhere over 100,000. They'll recommend in tech support and possibly in training too that anything possibly over 30,000, you might want to separate a company into several companies that have some legal entity reason why they can be separated or some way to separate them, just so that you can run depreciation a little bit faster. It does turn out that you have over 100,000 records. The depreciation can take a little bit of time. Running reports can take a little bit of time extra. And if there's any way that you can split that up, then putting those into separate databases would also facilitate making them run faster. Okay. Whoops, skip a slide there. So we recommend you have these 3 kinds of databases: a working or production database that you'll be using on a regular basis, and that's what you'll get from our product services group if you request them to build your data for you in the first place. So you just start using the program as soon as you get it. However, they will not be building and testing our archive database for you. That's something either you will do, and I'll show you how to do it in just a minute, or you'll be asking your IT department to do it for you. And there you might need to make sure you have a good friend in IT that will do this for you. So here's the process for doing this. There are 2 names that are given to a database. One is the database file name, and it will have an extension of .ddb on it that will be the file name. Then you'll have another name that you'll give the database that will be the name used in our program and displayed in our program. It would probably be best for you to have both of those names be the same name so that you don't run into a problem of erasing the file and then having the program say, wait a minute, I was using that file. Where's the data? So you want to be sure that these names are names you recognize and they don't cause you a problem. Let's see, I also have a note here that the database administrator, if you're working with the premier version of the software, only a database administrator can do the process of creating databases. Usually your IT department is responsible for that, and they don't usually give that responsibility to anyone else. They want to take care of it themselves because they maintain it and they're responsible. So find a good friend in the IT department when you come into this issue and convince them that it's important for you to have these archive databases available and the testing databases or database available for you. So I'll be switching back to the program now and creating the database. The database creation is done from the File menu under Database List Manager. And if you have the premier version of our software, you won't even have this option. This is something the IT department will have to do for you, and you'll have to request them to do it. They have another database administrator program that does that. But if you have the single user version of the program or the network version, you'll be able to go in and do this process. So it says what database you want to create. And notice I have the working one that I put my import into. I have a training one that we use for training purposes. And then I have a test that I did yesterday just to check and see how things would work. But let me go ahead and create a new one. So if I start with create a new database, and let me call this one just new database, so we don't lose track of what we're doing here. And I press tab to move down. Notice here I have the two names, the database name as it's going to be called in Save Fixed Assets and displayed. Then the new database with a .bdb. That's the extension on every database. I'm going to put it into the data folder where all of my other databases are, just to make it easier for me to find them later if I need to. But I could browse and put this anywhere. One of the dangers that we found people have when they try to put it anywhere is that they try to put it somewhere on a drive or a server that they lose access to. And then they don't have access to their data. So again, it probably is best for you to put it where all of your other data is. So I'm going to say, okay, ready to accept that. And now I have my new database with no companies in it yet. It's just sitting there waiting to be a database to use, to put companies into. Okay, so usually you'll have one that is your working one. You'll have one that's your testing one, and then you'll have one that's your archive one, that you'll be putting archive data into. Okay, so let me go ahead and close this down and go back to my spreadsheet. Let me go on to the next slide, or back to my file here. So the two names, who can create the database file? Again, remember that if you have the light or standard network version of the program, you will probably have the permissions to create the database, or if you have security set up in the program, that permission will be given to the supervisor only, probably. And you'll be able to use the database list manager like I just did. Okay. With the premier depreciation, your database administrator will have to do that. So just be aware of those conditions. Now we have another polling question for you. This one says, can a database file contain more than one company? So is there enough that I've mentioned that it gives you any indication to the answer for this? And Bob will be bringing up that question for you.
Okay, Paul, the question has been launched.
Okay.
So now that you can see the question, go ahead and answer yes or no. Okay, it looks like most people have had a chance to vote. I'm going to go ahead and close the polling question. The question has now been closed. Paul, back to you.
Okay, so of course, the answer to this question was yes. There were enough of you that indicated you weren't sure about that. So let me remind you that a database can be created just for one company, or it can even be created for no companies like I did there the first time when I created it without a company in it. However, if you have a test database and you need to test more than one company at a time, you can put both a copy of both of those companies into the database. So the program does not have a limit to how many companies you can put in a database, but just keep in mind that your archive and your working database, the more companies that you have in it, the larger the database is, and the more the program needs to chug through the data to pick out the data you're interested in running depreciation on, adding new assets to, anything like that. Running reports on, especially for reports of any kind of subtotals. So just keep that in mind, that the program itself doesn't limit how many companies can be in the database. You can put more than one, but you might be thinking about, well, my companies are fairly large. I want to keep my databases as small as I possibly can. So I'm just going to put one company in each of my databases that you work with. So there's just a limitation on how much time you can take to run through your data. Okay, moving on to our next topic then, copying a company into a database. So we'll look at this in at least two different ways. Why would we want to do this? So the advantages of copying into a database is, first of all, the same as I mentioned earlier, to have a test option. A copy that you can work on that is not your working data. So you can mess it up, you can have major errors on it, and just test some process that you say, I wonder if this will work, or I need to see this work before I decide that I want to do it with my working data. So that's the advantage of having that as a separate company in a test database that you could then work on and play with. And I use the word kind of loosely, play, because you're always working, I know. And then also having an archive of your data information. The archive being how the data looks at the end of every given month, or how it looks at the end of a year or any particular period in time. You could say, to get to that data quickly, I'd like to be able to. So let me switch back over to the program. And we'll put a company into a database. So we go to the File menu, and we're going to do Company Utilities for this process. I'm going to actually do it a fairly, well, it's just the safest way. The best practice is, anytime you go in to make a copy of a company, first make a backup. So I go into making a backup of my data. Here's that import test data that I brought into the working database. So I'll go on to the next step here. It says, do you want to make a backup? Notice I have several backups already of other data that I've made backups recently, either for other classes or just to practice for this class today. So this is also the training folder that this is being put in. I could put this anywhere. It creates a zip copy of the data in a way that there's no relation to our program. It will be able to restore it back into our program, but it has to be restored and able to be used in our program. So you could put this anywhere that's safe. I could put it on a flash drive. I have a couple of flash drives in here. Okay, a DVD drive, so, or a network drive. I could put that out on a network drive if I wanted to. I'm putting it right back into the folder here, just in case you guys have any questions about it. We can pull it back up quickly. So this is my backup, and I'll go ahead and put the word backup on here of import test. So normally you'd be putting a date and time that you're doing this backup to say, okay, that's as of that particular date and time, I made this backup. So I'll go ahead and save that record. And you may notice that backup processes take a little bit amount of time here to run. So that one's done. Remember, only 205 records here. Do I want to do another backup? No, thank you, I'm done with that. So let's take a look and see, what can we do with that? If we go back into the File menu, under Company Utilities, we have to restore that backup in order to use it in our program. The backup itself is a safe and separate file, a zipped version of the data that can then really be put anywhere. But restore allows me to go looking for it. So if I go back looking, let me go to my test import backup. This one here that I just did. Open that back up. Now I have the option to put that back into the database that I already had it in. We'll go on to the next step here. By the way, it always identifies any companies that are in the backup, and more than one company can be put into a backup. I could back up all of my companies. I wanted to, all of them that are in the same database. So I'll go on to the next step here. And it says, okay, where do you want to put this? Now I already have that company in the working database. I'm going to try to put it back in there with the same name, and it's going to object to that. So first of all, it says, what do you want to do with history? I don't want to purge any history. I just want to do the restore. So it says, okay, but you have that name in there already. So I'm going to say this is test number 3. just to get a different name here. And I'll rename that, and it will go ahead and allow me to import that company back into that same database that the company was already in. Do I want to do another one? No, thank you again. And opening up the asset records, I could say, okay, system administration, open up the company, and there they are. The test number 2 that I imported and test number 3 copy that I just made. So I say, okay, thank you very much. And of course, it's going to look like the same data that test number 2 did, because it is exactly the same data. So to give you an idea of what the information looks like there. Okay, let me switch back to my PowerPoint presentations. Another polling question for you then. Can a backup file be added directly to an existing company? Yes or no?
Okay, I'm going to launch the question now. The polling question is now open. Please answer yes or no. Okay, it looks like about 3/4, now 80% have voted. Not most everybody has voted, I think, that has wanted to participate. I'm going to go ahead and take down the polling question. The polling question is now closed. Paul, turn it back to you.
So the answer to this question is no, but it's all based on the one word, directly. A backup file has to be restored. The restore has to be merged into an existing company. So there's a 3-step process you need to do to complete adding assets to an existing company. You have to take a backup, restore it, and then take the restore and merge it with an existing company. You cannot go directly from the backup file. In fact, you can't go directly from a backup file to anything. It has to be restored in order to be used in our program. So that was the distinction we were trying to make here, is that you recognize the backup files are really sacred. They're zip files that are stored, and they're always available to you to pull up. And in fact, let me just mention here briefly that when you get a new version of the software, you should take every one of your backups, restore them in the new version. Occasionally, new versions have new database setup, and backups need to be restored to get into that new database setup. But then they should be backed up again, so that every backup you have is done in the very latest version that you also have. It does turn out, we've had some companies recently that have backups that go back to 2006 or 2008, and it turns out they can't restore those. They have to send those to us and have us charge them to restore them so that they can use them and take a look at them in their current 2020 version of the software. So if you take care of that, you will not need to use our services for that reason. Okay, moving on to our next slide. So what we've covered today is the custom import, creating a database file, and then putting a copy of a company into one of your database files that you might want to do your testing on, to have as an archive, or just something that is not your working database that you work with as you move along. Okay, that brings us to the end of our presentation for today. So if there's any questions, please feel free to go ahead and ask those questions. And Bob, it looks like we've got a couple that may need for me to do some demonstrating of the software. So I'm going to switch back over to the software and go ahead and answer the question. And if you'd like me to demonstrate your answer, I can.
Okay, thanks. Great job, Paul. There were a few questions that came up during your presentation. One of the questions is, will I be able to access this information, including your notes and the PowerPoint slides? And the answer is yes. And so the same website that you used to register for this webinar, when you go to it, you'll notice there's a button to schedule for an upcoming webinar, but there's also another button to click on demand, which is a way of looking at past recordings of previous webinars. And so that will be posted soon. I'm not sure that I can promise you a date right now, but it will be posted soon, maybe before the end of this week, where you can find not only a recording of this webinar, but also the PowerPoint file that Paul used to make his presentation. So that will be available. Another question, this was an interesting question, Paul. It came up about, well, why do I need to create an archive folder if I'm going to be making a backup? So let me explain here that you've got some options. As a user of the software, you can create a backup file like Paul showed you. One of the reasons for creating a backup file is just to manage risk. You know, whenever you create a backup file, you now have a fallback position. So you may want to protect yourself at various times when you're using the software. But also you may want to create backups at the end of a fiscal period. And for example, at the end of a fiscal year, you might want to do it more frequently than that, but let me just use that as an example. You could create a backup at the end of a fiscal year, and now you've got that data preserved, that snapshot, if you will, for that moment in time when you created the backup. So if the auditors come to your office and they're asking you questions about that fiscal year, you could always do a restore like what Paul showed you. And you could restore it to whatever database file you like. But another option is you could create an archive database file like Paul showed you. And then you could copy the company, or you could restore from a backup file onto that archive database. And so you could have essentially archives from various past years that are sitting on that archive database. Now, this is your option. If it's me, I'm probably want to go for redundancy. So I'm probably going to do both. I'm going to create the backup file, and I'm also going to copy the company onto my archive database so I have access to either. But it's up to you. You can do either, or you can do whatever you like. Is there a limit? I'm looking for more questions here that may have come up. Is there a limit to the number of lines you can import at one time? And I think what she means by that is there a limit to the number of rows in your spreadsheet that you can import? There's no hard and fast rule that I can give you on that, but I will share a story with you. I can remember teaching in San Diego about 12 years ago, and I had a very bright young man in the classroom who handled the books at Bolthouse Farms in Bakersfield. And he told me an interesting story. He said he tried to import 50,000 records from his spreadsheet and it crashed his system. And so he called tech support and they said, well, 50,000 is too many. Try this, just break apart your spreadsheet maybe into 5 files with no file containing more than 10,000 records. And so he said he did that and it worked out just fine. He had to go through the iteration 5 times, but as Paul showed you, once you've created that map, you can reuse it for a subsequent import. And so those, after you've created the map, the rest of that process can go very quickly. And so he did that and he said it worked out just fine. So even though I said there's no hard and fast rule, you may run into that there's just too much overhead into your source file. That's the spreadsheet that you're using. And so you may need to break it apart into smaller files. And so that's what you may want to do there. Let me see if there are any other questions. And by the way, if you're working on entering a question, you may want to raise your hand. That'll let me know that you're still working on entering a question. Let me also take the time to tell you that we are working on future webinars to present, and we're interested in your feedback. So is there a topic that you'd like to see a webinar a webinar presented on? Is there a particular subject or topic that you'd like to see in the future? So if so, you could put that into the chat. You've got on that control panel that you can see over on the right-hand side, a place that you can put in some information into the chat and give us an idea of what you would like to see in the future for a potential topic. I'm not seeing any hands go up, so we may have handled all of the questions. Let me turn it back to Paul for his concluding comments. Paul?
Okay, we have here some links that you could take advantage of to see what's available in our training. The login to SageU link, www.sage.u.com, will give you the option to register for one of our courses and to look up the courses that are available there too. Also under www.sageu.com/fixedassets, we list all of our courses. We have several courses that we offer at a particular time, East Coast and West Coast. We have several courses that are offered as ATLs, which is Anytime Learning, that you just listen to a recording and our demonstration of the software and some feature in the software. And usually those classes, I think the longest one might take 4 hours, but many are much less than that you can just get in quickly. And then of course, these classes like today, these webinars, we're doing these every month. So I'll be doing this one again, actually on the 23rd, so that anybody that missed today could come in and listen to it then. It will be exactly like today. I'm pretty comfortable with the way I presented it to you today, so we'll do it the same. But you'll get a list of the topics we have through the end of this year, and we hope that you feel free to volunteer, or excuse me, feel free to give us information about any features that you don't see covered in either these webinars or any other topic that you have a question about. So feel free to let us know, is there a topic we should be covering in an hour discussion like this today? If you do take a class, my promo code over at the right, TRNPLEN10, will give you a 10% discount above any other discount. Use your company, of course, a discount above any other discount you might have for your courses. And some of you, if you're on the gold plan for our software, you get your classes for free. So be sure to take a look at that and see if you're taking full advantage of everything that you have available to you. Okay, at the top of the screen, there's an https://www.sagecity.com/global/resources. Sage City is where we put out information about our program. We get questions about our program from users that say, I had this issue, I'm stuck. And even if they've had a class, occasionally they'll say, I know the teacher mentioned this, I know I should remember, but I don't. So can you help me? And in Sage City, then you'll be able to see what their question is, and then what our answer is from tech support or from one of our instructors to say, this is the information you're asking about. We hope we've covered your topic. So again, you'll get a copy of these slides, you'll get a copy of the links you can go to here. Feel free to take advantage of them. And I guess for today, that's it. Thank you so much for joining us.